welcome to the first intro to compost tea. I'm Rhonda Mace. I do the school outreach for Chittenden Solid Waste District, also known as CSWD. So I just want to give you a little overview of what we're going to be, the plan for the day. So this is an hour long. It depends on how many questions and how many answers I can give you for how long it's going to last. I had scheduled it for an hour and it might be less than that. We shall see. So first we'll go over just a quick intro to who CSWD is, and then a little brief overview of what compost tea is, some of the current research on compost tea, which was interesting when I was diving deeper into it. And then I'll show you guys how to make compost tea. And then I'll show you the results to my personal experiments using compost tea here at my house. And then we'll do questions and answers. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom. It is just me. Usually there's a wing person helping out with questions. But today it's just me, so bear with me as I navigate all of it. So for those of you that may know me, I am very much a hands-on person. So we're just going to go through a few slides here, and then I'm going to open it up so you can see the operation going on here and my face, whether you like it or not. So CSWD is a municipality. And basically, we are tasked with finding fun and fantastical things to do with all the stuff that people in Chittenden County no longer want or need. That can come from businesses, schools, whether you work, play, or live in Chittenden County, whatever is generated and you need to get rid of, we need to find something to do with it and hopefully not landfill it. That is one thing that we're trying not to do. I'm trying to keep as much out of the landfill as possible. So we have a couple of different facilities. Some of you might be familiar with our drop-off centers. We have 7 drop-off centers throughout the county. We also have the environmental depot where you can, find a home for your household hazardous waste. We've got the materials recovery facility where all your blue bin recyclables go to get sorted out and then sold to those that are doing the recycling. And then finally, we have Green Mountain Compost where food scraps get turned into fantastic food for the plants. And that's basically all I really wanted to introduce CSWD with. We do manage a lot of different materials. And today's webinar is really based on using the compost to create something different out of the compost that you can use that I've actually been using in my house. So that would be compost tea. And now let me stop doing this and hot dog. Okay. Sorry, there's something that came up here and I can't seem to read this far away. Ugh, getting old is difficult. All right, so compost tea, just a brief introduction. I'll be straightforward with you. I have never made compost tea. I've heard of it many times. I heard many people love using it. And on my last worm composting webinar, there was a couple of folks that were interested in using compost tea. So I said, well, I'll do a webinar on it, despite not having ever done it myself. And then I'll dive into the research that's out there to see what the results are. So that's what we're here today. So if you guys have used compost tea or have made it, please put it in the Q&A and let me know what you guys are doing out there and how you do it. I am by far no expert. I am a novice at this, but it has been a fun adventure for the last 2 months. Exploring the world of compost tea. So what is it? Basically, you're just taking your compost, and whether that's your compost in the backyard or commercial compost that you bought at a garden center, or for me, I compost using worms. So the compost tea I used in my experiment was actually worm compost. So any of those compost combinations will work. And you basically are making a tea just like you would make a cup of tea in your kitchen. So you're putting it in some sort of bag, you're putting it in water, and you're letting it steep. And there are varying lengths of time. When I was looking this up and really diving into the peer-reviewed research, and being a scientist, that's what I like to go to just to verify the results. But there was a lot of different results out there. So some people are like, yeah, some of the research is like, yeah, that's great. It's beneficial in fighting and suppressing diseases. It's beneficial in just nutrients. But how you make it, like how you make your compost, what compost you use, and how you make the tea, it makes it extremely variable. So it's a really hard thing to study and to get consistent results across the board, because the basically all the microbes that are in your compost, all those fantastic little critters that are breaking down the food scraps and the leaves and the paper and whatever you're putting in your compost pile and turning it into fantastic compost to put in your garden, those guys vary too, depending on what you're doing. My worm bin is very different microbes than the compost pile outside, and very different microbes than what is at Green Mountain Compost, our industrial compost facility. So that was one thing that I learned. I'm like, So therefore the tea is very different. And then comparing that across different studies is difficult, because you'd have to like pull out and look at all of those microbes, which there are a lot. And if you've ever worked in a lab culturing bacteria or even fungal spores is can be hard and difficult. So without sounding like too pessimistic on it, there were plenty. There was enough research out there to show the benefits of it, and that it does suppress disease, and it does obviously help with nutrients, because you're seeping out all of those nutrients that are in the compost anyway. So that's just kind of a brief overview, and what I found in the research. And again, it varied quite a bit. There are those that produce compost tea and like garden sites and such that aren't necessarily peer-reviewed research, but they tout the benefits of compost tea. And then when I dove into the peer-reviewed journal of research, there wasn't a lot. I'll be honest, there wasn't a whole lot to go on. It's not a heavily researched topic, but becoming more and more popular. But there again was varying results, from didn't really show any difference as far as disease suppression goes, to it showed great results in root stock and hardiness of the plant and so on and so forth. So probably not what you are tuning in to find out today, that there are big varying results. But I say, because I'm all about experimenting, I'm saying try to give it a go. It's really not that difficult. So we'll walk through the steps of how I did it. It's there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of recipes, if you will. I kind of went the simplest route. You will see that people will call to add like molasses in there. The sugar will, keep the microbes alive and give them energy to reproduce in the tea. I did not use molasses. I found a couple of different conflicting results on that, and folks that have been doing it with molasses and without molasses. So I decided not to go with the whole sugar thing, and keep it as simple as possible, because I feel simplicity will encourage folks to try this at home. So let's get started on how I did it. Of course, because I like to reuse everything possible, you can go out and buy like a fine mesh bag. You can use like those nylon stocking things. I just happen to have in my textile box, or my clothes box for drop off, I had a old pair of long johns that the elastic band no longer was elasticy. So I just cut the leg off to use as my bag to put the compost in. So Basically, this is my tea bag, and I just used some old garden twine tied off the bottom, and then you can fill a stocking with compost. And again, I'm using worm compost, but you can use your backyard. One thing I did learn, and this by experiment, I read about it and then I was like, we'll give it a go. I made 2 different batches of compost tea. The first batch was from worm compost that had been curing or sitting around for nearly a year. And you want to make sure, and curing your compost, you're letting it sit around and let the microbes continue working on your compost after you harvest it out of your bin, whether that's your worm bin or your backyard bin, is critical, because food scraps tend to have a lot of volatile fatty acids, and those acids can burn root stock, your roots, especially in seedlings. And so the longer you let your compost sit, the more those microbes can work and make sure that all of that organic matter, or most of that organic matter, especially the food scraps, are all broken down. And so the longer you let your compost sit, the better it is. And those that microbial population will grow. And the more microbes you have going into your compost that you then put into your soil, the better chance you have, or better chance there is, that those microbes will outcompete the bad guys, like the pathogens and the diseases that do attack plants. They will outcompete, and that's one of the benefits of using compost, whether that's worm or your backyard or even commercial compost, is that it helps suppress disease. So with that said, my first batch of tea was made with almost 1-year-old worm compost. The second batch I made with compost that I pulled right out of the worm bin that was ready to harvest, but hadn't cured at all, hadn't sat around at all. So there was probably a lot of volatile fatty acids in it. And I got different results. And so my conclusion to that is, make sure you use the oldest compost you have sitting around, or use commercial compost, which is already ready to go and has been cured for a length of time. And at Green Mountain Compost, it varies between 3 to 6 months, just depends. So in my first batch, all was going good. I did a growth trial, which I'll show you the results too. And I just busted open the pots this morning. So I was a little surprised at the results myself. So I'll share that with you in a moment. But I also used it all in my house plants. And the first go around in February, great results. The plants seemed fine, no big deal. The second batch, which is what I used, the new compost, the non-cured, didn't sit around and actually age and eat up all of the food scraps left over in it. I used that, and several of my plants were visibly not happy, especially my fern that looked like it was all burnt. Now, might have been coincidental. However, it was 3 different plants in my house that seem to have similar reactions. So I conclude, and this is just me personally, and this wasn't documented or scientifically, scientific method was performed here, but I do believe it had something to do with me using fresh worm compost as opposed to stuff that had been cured and sitting around and actually had time to mature. That lesson learned. And I think also, even in my growth trial tests with peas, everything was going great in the worm tea pot. And then when I started using the second batch, there seemed to be a little delay in growth and some crumpling of the leaves. So I do believe that really does matter. So that was one lesson learned for you guys. And if you guys have other results, or you guys know something I don't, please, again, put it in the Q&A. I'll be checking that in just a second to check in with you guys. But that was what I concluded. So how do you make it? Get yourself some sort of bag, all right? Some sort of tea bag, if you will. I use just maybe 2 cups of compost so a cup per gallon is what I used. I tried to find different recipes out there, and really people were just I don't know, I just dumped some in there. The research papers had allotted amounts, but I couldn't really gather even if they like had some sort of formulation for how much compost to water. So I kind of winged it and did a cup per gallon. So I have a 2-gallon bucket of water. I should get that, huh? So just, again, reusing a local color bucket, all rinsed out and cleaned, obviously, no paint in it. So just a 2-gallon bucket of water. I've got my tea bag, and then you just dump your compost right into the tea bag, like such. All right, and then I just kind of twisted it shut, and then I'm using, where did that go? Oh, there we go. I'm just using a folder, a binder clip, a big giant one, and then I just, clip it on here just to hold the compost in the bag itself. All right, and then you're ready to go. So you now, and I have like just a stick that I took outside, so it'll sit like right in the bucket, right like that. Now, there is aerated and non-aerated compost tea. I chose the aerated version just because I know that microbes, these particular microbes, love oxygen. They live in oxygen. That's why we have to aerate our compost piles. Why my worms, I mean, aside from my worms needing oxygen, but why I aerate and make sure there's good airflow in my worm bins as well. So I figured I'll just follow that line. There is an anaerobic method. I didn't try that all out. So what I did is I just had a friend that had an old fish tank, and he let me use and borrow his bubbler. So I just used this aerator and pop it in the bottom of the bucket. You can also just go ahead and like stir it up every once in a while, but then you have to be a little more active with that. But as long as there's oxygen getting into the water and the microbes are getting oxygen, you should be all set. Varying days of how long you want to let this go. I actually like let the tea steep for 4 days, both batches for 4 days. And that was just from a book that I have from another Rhonda, NC State worm wrangler, Rhonda Sherman. And so I have her book, and she just kind of did a little briefing on compost tea, but she had mentioned 4 days. So I was like, I'll go with 4 days because she is like my hero. So I just let it steep for 4 days. I've read anything from 24 hours to 1 week. Try it out, see what happens. Again, this was all an experiment. I probably should have done all of this before I actually like put together a webinar, but I figured whatever, it's Saturday morning, we can hang out and hopefully I can learn something, a little something from you guys too. So just I put the air stone in there. And again, it doesn't really matter how big it is, and you don't need to get all fancy. You can go on Front Porch Forum and see if anybody's got anything laying around. I just happened to have a friend that had one. And then you're just going to plug it in and let it bubble away for 4 days. Again, if you want to not use, or you're not using an aerator, you can go in and like just stir it every couple of hours just to make sure that there's oxygen moving through there and it doesn't go anaerobic or without oxygen. Or if you want to experiment with that, feel free to do that. And I'd love to see, see your results. I just wouldn't use the tea on something, a cherished plant that you love. And then that is really the setup completely. And again, after 4 days, then you just pull it out. I just squeeze the compost, and you can see already that it's steeping, and well, maybe you can't see that as well, but it's already steeping. I'm going to put it back in there because I'm going to make a batch. I made a 2-gallon bucket because I know that it takes about 2 gallons of water to water my plants for one go around with all the plants that I have in my house. I would only make as much as you're going to use. So one of the things that I learned as well is that you shouldn't be storing it if you do need to store it. So for my growth trial, I actually did store it. I stored it in an old milk container. I dated it to make sure I knew how long it has been in there. There was one research paper, and again, it's only one research paper, but one paper that the scientist experimented with several days in the refrigerator, because the refrigerator will keep it okay and will slow the microbial activity. So they're not using up all the oxygen that's in the water already. But he left it in there for 14 days. And he said after 14 days, he noticed there was and he was testing the actual microbial activity in the tea. So he noticed a decrease in microbial activity after 14 days in the fridge. So I just dated it, popped it in my fridge, clearly labeled it. And then I just used this to water for the growth trial. For my plants, I've been doing it every other week. And I just usually do the 2 gallons on a Friday night. And then Saturday mornings, I water all of my plants. And I know that 2 gallons will take care of all of my plants inside. And aside from that second batch that I made with new worm compost, everybody seems to have recovered from that, thankfully. But I've been using the older compost as well. So they seem to be happy. And my Christmas cactus is getting ready to bloom. That might be coincidental, but it's getting ready to bloom again. So I'm very excited about that. So once it's steeped, then you just like squeeze out all of the tea. You can pop that compost back into either your bin, or if you have a storage container, I have like a big bin of worm compost, because I generate, like, they make it all winter long. And then by spring, summer, when I'm ready to add it into my garden, stuff that I've been collecting since last year will go in first, and then I'll let that other stuff sit and cure, and then I'll add that into the garden. So that stuff, the tea, the compost I used for the tea will go back into the garden eventually. So, because it's still active, I mean, as long as you're aerating it, everybody's still in there. So let's go to, I guess I'll show you my experiment. So I had 1 pot that I put, so I used pea plants. 1 pot I just watered with straight up water, and 1 pot I used the worm tea. And again, I used 2 different batches of worm tea, and I think I messed that up on the second batch because I used the new worm compost. But this is like driving me to do yet more experiments on this compost tea thing. So results are in. This is the plant from just water. And I watered them the same amount of water, just 1 with water, 1 with worm tea. And so very tall. It got really, really leggy. They were all under a grow light, same length of time, same distance away from the grow light. You could see the rootstock on this bad boy is pretty good. Again, this is just the water, right? But it is, you probably can't see it through the video that much, but it is yellowing just a little bit. So that's one observation. On the roots, which you can't see through here though, and with peas, you know, they have like the little nodules on their root system. There are a lot of nodules on this one that was watered just with water. But that was a pretty nice rootstock. I wasn't expecting that. And then this is the one watered with worm tea. All right. So I can see it from here. Again, the video doesn't like really, sometimes if I do this, it'll like zoom in. Doesn't really show a whole lot of color, but this color is a lot greener than the one watered with the plant, but the rootstock isn't as prominent, as long at least. There's still a lot of nodules on here, so that's a good sign too. This plant was actually it was a little sturdier. It wasn't as leggy as the water plant. And you can see there is like quite a size difference there. But this one was still like standing straight up. This one was kind of going like all over the place. I mean, it is a pea, but so I don't know if that has something to do with it. And this one actually has, so this is the worm compost tea. This one actually has a flower starting, whereas the other one, the one watered with water, does not have any flowers. And the worm tea, so again, started with the old worm compost tea. They actually germinated first. The worm tea pot germinated first, and then finally the water one germinated. But then the growth rate seemed to change over time. And again, I switched it up and used that new worm tea. And I think that kind of caused, there was a little leaf death at the bottom here too. And I think that really had to do with just the immature worm compost that I made tea out of, and I think I kind of ruined the experiment. So sorry. But that's, and again, I'm doing it with my house plants and they seem to be like doing really great. And, keep in mind that you have to water, you have to feed your plants inside as well. The water's great. They really like that, but make sure you're feeding them too. And compost is a great way to do it. And I think using compost tea is a little easier than trying to stuff like compost into the pots themselves. If you're anything like me, I'm not very good at repotting plants, but I tend to fill them a little too full. But like there's no room left for compost on the top. Because basically when you're adding compost to your garden, you can, the same effect is happening. So it rains and that rain trickles through the compost and is creating tea that goes down into the roots of your garden plants. Inside, and this is where I think compost tea is actually the most beneficial, inside you can, give them nutrients, liquid nutrients that is easier for them to take up. Also, I've been experimenting with using it as a foliar spray. I have one plant that tends to get, I don't know what it is that gets on them, some sort of bugs, mites or something. So I've been spraying that bad boy every other week with compost tea and hope that it might keep those mites at bay. I haven't seen any recently, so that's good. And we'll see what happens. All right, I'm going to scooch up here because I need to put my glasses on to read the Q&A. Let me get this out of the way. But so the conclusion is, and I apologize because I thought that there would be a lot more information out there about compost tea. But the conclusion is experiment and let me know how it goes for you guys, because I would really like to know how your plants are responding to compost tea. But I'm going to keep on doing some experiments here at home. All right, glasses. All right. I don't see any mute or video buttons. Can I assume I'm muted? Yes, Kara, you are muted because it's a webinar. I probably should have changed it into a meeting so we could have a discussion, but unfortunately I did not do that. And I don't think I can do that now that I started it. So my apologies. Please repeat your research source. All right, I can send out the sources of my research in the follow-up email. So in 3 days, so Tuesday morning around 10, you will get a follow-up email from me, and I'll put all of the research papers that I found in that follow-up email. So then you can read them yourselves. I have a couple of other little sites that, there was it's the Illinois, University of Illinois, I believe it was, that basically said, compost tea is fine. But why go through the trouble when you can just spread compost on your garden and let the rain make the tea? And again, I would say that I am more of a believer, or I would say a better application for the compost tea is for your indoor plants, your house plants, or even starters. But again, make sure that you're using that mature compost that's been sitting around for a little while and doesn't have any fresh food particles in it. Let's see. And I'm recording this webinar too, so you guys will get a link to the webinar as well. Can you tell us more about curing worm compost? Oh, okay. Yeah, I can definitely do that, Laura. So basically, and this goes for your backyard compost too. So once it's basically all the food scraps are broken down, and in my worm bins, I use paper for the carbon source instead of leaves. So once everything is broken down, and sometimes that can take 6 months, it just depends. I get the worms to move out of it, and I take all of that and I dump it just in a regular storage container, something like this. Right, like this, even though it says recycling, ignore that. But so I put it in a storage container like that. I have holes drilled on the top, and on the sides of it, like at the top of the sides, just to allow aeration. Again, like that compost is still living. It is not like, it's not dead or anything. There's still a lot of living organisms. And those organisms are actually what, I mean, aside from the nutrients in the compost itself, those microorganisms are really what's going to like fight off any diseases or plant attacks. So it is critical that you treat compost as if it's a living critter. So make sure that it, you know, contains some moisture and or retains some moisture and has air going into it. So I just store that in a container down in my basement, you know, 50-ish degrees over the winter time at least. And then every once in a while, just get down and give it a little fluffle duffle do ya. And every once in a while being like maybe once a month, just to make sure. And with my worm compost, I'm always going to get like worms that are still in there. I'm always going to have like cocoons. So new worms are going to be hatching. So for me, I just like to keep those guys, you know, a little thriving and alive. And then come, you know, usually like I said, it's usually a year-ish, 6 months to a year. I let it cure. And then I feel free to use it in the garden. And when you're using compost in the garden, and if you're using backyard compost or even worm compost, a little chunks of food scraps aren't going to be a big deal because you've got usually a pretty big surface area, and then it'll trickle down all through the whole ground. If you're using it indoors with your plants indoors, that's where I think it's a lot more critical that you let it cure if you're going to be using it in your indoor plants. But my worms produce a whole lot of compost, so I've got, you know, I'm sitting on top of like 2-year-old compost as well from my worms, which then I will turn out into my gardens this year. So I hope that helps you. For your backyard, you could just put it in a pile, all right? So like, and depending on how many bin systems you work with, like saying your backyard compost pile, you can just take it out of your bin and set it to the side. That's what I used to do. I used to use a tumbler system when I composted outside, when I was able to do that. And then I would dump all the compost in October. I would dump it all out onto a tarp. I'd sift out all of the chunkies, throw the chunky monkeys back into my my compost bin, my tumbler, and then I would let that from October to say April or May, let it kind of sit there. And yeah, it got a little frozen over the winter time, but it was still working a bit in the middle. And it had from like October till like a heavy, like till it started getting really cold. And then as it thawed out, it cured as well. And that seemed to work really well. But again, that was my outdoor gardens. I didn't use that. I didn't use that in my indoor bins. And if you're buying commercial compost, you don't have to worry about any of that because it's already been cured. Where do you cure your vermicompost? I think I answered that. So yeah, I just put it in my basement. And I have a couple of different bins going. You don't have to go to this extent. It's just I have a lot of worms because I have my own home system. And now that I'm working at home, I brought my work worms with me too. So everybody's like in like, well, 3 happy families, at least I got 3 different bin systems going on. So there's a lot of worm composting, you know, happening. So in the last year that I've been working from home, it's like over 100 pounds that the worms have produced. So I've got a bunch of bins downstairs. And typically yeah, like I said, so starting from last year, I'll use last year's stuff first and I date it. Like I date each bin when it got started. So I know. And then I just get out and check it like once a month to make sure that there's moisture. You can always, you know, just get a spray bottle of water. I also cover the top with moist newspaper and then pop the lid on that has the holes in it. So that way everything's staying nice and moist because those microbes need water to survive. They will just kind of shut down and hang out until it, you know, until you reintroduce it to your garden. That's fine. But I like to treat it as a living organism. I mean, soil is full of life as is compost. So I just kind of treat it like it's alive. Where did you get your water? Oh, I just use tap water. I have a well, so I don't have city water. Good point though. you probably would want to use, if you have like town water and it's chlorinated, you could put it in like a gallon jug, like a gallon milk jug, or just leave it sit in the bucket for 2 days. And that will usually allow enough time to gas off any of the chlorine that's in there. So you should be fine if you just let it sit in the bucket for 2 days, just at room temperature, and that chlorine won't gas off. That kill the bacteria. Yeah, so that is very true, Marlene. So again, if you just let it sit, or you can run it through a filter system. If you filter water, that's fine. I used to raise amphibians and reptiles, or I used to rescue them, and we had chlorinated water. But even the amphibians that breathe through their skin, and my worms as well, when I was on town water, I just let it sit for 2 days, even out of a milk jug, like an old milk jug, and the chlorine, nobody was ever harmed. And if the worms aren't harmed by the chlorinated water, the microbes will be pretty resilient to it too, as long as you let it sit for 2 days, at least 2 days. You can let it sit for longer. We also have a Christmas cactus that's blooming a second time. Okay. Well, Stephanie's got a Christmas cactus that's blooming a second time too. So maybe it has nothing to do with my compost tea. It's all good though. Again, I mean, it wasn't like a rigorous scientific study I was doing. It was just kind of jumping on it. Like I said, there was a couple people that requested, asked if I could do something on it. So I said, why not? How does temperature affect the brewing tea? Oh, beautiful, Brett. I didn't even get into that. Sorry. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Temperature does matter. So these microbes are what we call mesophilic. So they like medium temperatures. Basically anything from, they're going to thrive the most between like 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. You don't have to heat your water. I did not heat my water. I did start it in warm-ish water. So I think it was like at 70 degrees when I started it. Let me look at my recording here. Yeah, so 71 degrees when I started it. But the room up here, my office where it was brewing, was like 65 most of the time, 60, 65 degrees. And yeah, but temperature does matter. It's probably too cold, especially right now. And they will not be very active, just like in your compost piles. So they definitely thrive the most at like 60 to 75 degrees. Upper limit being like 100 degrees. I'd say lower limit being about 35 degrees, but that's really low, and they're not going to be at their optimal power of reproduction and disease fighting abilities. Please confirm the proportion of compost to water. All right, Elisa, or Eliza, whichever it is. I use 1 gallon of water and 1 cup of compost. That's how I did it, and it seemed to work fine. I saw like 3.5 cups to 5 gallons of water. Well, it was like, I scaled that down because it was like a 20-gallon tank or something. Some people get into like large operations, and they actually sell compost tea online, which is interesting as well. Seeming what I have read, it doesn't really hold up for long-term storage. Unless you're storing it in the fridge, and it might come refrigerated. But again, you don't want to store it in the fridge longer than 14 days from the one research paper that I read. I couldn't find anything else on that in time for the webinar, at least. But so 14 days, and then it's not that it goes bad. It's just that the microbes the microbial population starts dropping off after 14 days, or so this one experiment showed. All right, let me get that out of the way. Don, how are you doing? So Don was one of the people, actually, nice that you could join this morning. Don was one of the people that actually talked to me, and he is a fellow worm wrangler as well. And we had a discussion about doing compost tea. So he was one of my inspirations for doing this morning. So the liquid worm, oh yeah. Okay, so he's asking about, so the liquid that is leached out of my compost and collected at the bottom of the bin is of no use and be flushed down the toilet, ? Yes, so there is a difference between leachate or the juice that's running out of either your regular compost, your backyard compost, or your worm bin if you're a worm composter. So that's because, I mean, the leachate is going to have all of that volatile fatty acid stuff in it that can do a lot of harm to your plants. It can have other phytotoxins in it that have been introduced to with your food that haven't yet been broken down by the microbes and or the worms. So don't use the leachate. I used to use it in my plants, and I used to dilute it pretty heavily. When I first started worm composting many years ago, I was like, oh, worm tea, look at that. But I didn't see any adverse effects to it. But again, I diluted it really heavily, probably like 1 to 10. But over the years, I learned that leachate can be harmful, not always, but can be. And sometimes if you have like really like watermelon, really, really high water content food scraps that you're adding to your bin, it'll leach out, and then it'll get like kind of like a swampy smell. So if you're getting that swampy smell, that means it's gone anaerobic, and it's a whole different community of microbes in there. And some of those can be detrimental to your plants. So I just now pitch it out into the yard, and that's what I do with it. Or you can flush it down the toilet. Either way. Thanks, Don. I forgot all about the leachate issues. Yeah. What type of paper do you use in the compost? So, good question. I use paper towels that have like no chemical cleaners on them. And I usually go and grab the paper towels over at Green Mountain Compost. That's where my office is. So when I go into my office once or twice a week, I grab all of the paper towels in there because it's free paper. I also use the 7 days and all of the little, I live in Williston, so the Williston Observer, after I read it, I just shred it up. And so newspaper, paper towels, shredded paper, like if you're shredding, like it's tax time, if you're shredding tax documents, the worms, I tell you, will not divulge any of your information. They will eat it up, and you can just like feed your plants outside with your old tax forms. So it's a great way to get rid of those sensitive documents as well. Do not use like shiny paper or magazines or anything like that. There's coating on it, and worms breathe through their skin. So you just want to be cognizant of that. I wouldn't use it in your backyard compost either, because I'm not exactly sure what they spray it with to make it shiny and such. So don't use like shiny paper in it. But you can use cardboard. I know a lot of people that use cardboard, or like straight up paper plates, not the coated, not the ones with the plastic on it or the fancy little pictures on it, because they typically are coated with plastic, which the worms will not eat. Nor will your microbes in your backyard bin. But if it's like the flimsy paper, or like the Chinette, I'm going to say it's Chinette paper plates, like the sturdier ones that are just strictly paper, you can, always grab those and shred those up. Smaller the pieces, the faster they'll break down. Chloramine does not break down. Okay. And I don't know what they use to sterilize water these days. I just assume it's just chlorine. But if that's the case, then maybe you should just get some distilled water. Or I don't know if you boil it. I'm not up on, I used to teach chemistry, but I'm not up on the chloramines and how they break down or do not break down. So I don't know what water these days is, but I've never experienced a problem even with, town water, using it in my worm bin. I've not experienced a problem with that. But if it is, then maybe use distilled or bottled water, or get it from a spring. This is unrelated to your talk, which is wonderful, but I just noticed that Abby Falk is online too. Someone I have been trying to connect with. Oh, so Ann Lipsit says, hello, Abby. Fantastic. All right, just like reading these all out loud. I've used straight chicken compost in a bucket filled with water and just left it by the garden. Used it watered down a bit to water my garden. It seemed to work all right. Well, fantastic, Cindy. Thank you for that. So yeah, like I said, experiment. And so Cindy, so it was chicken compost. So it was like chicken litter that you let sit around and compost down. So yeah, I mean, even like manure compost would work great on that as well. So when I was a kid, I had a horse and we used to let that compost and just spread it on the garden and then like water the garden really well. So the plants seemed to like it. We didn't starve as children. Would you put shredded paper in your regular compost? Great question, Anne. Sure, why not? If you don't have enough leaves, I mean, I would definitely use leaves because it's a whole lot less work. If you've got fallen leaves or fall leaves, save those up and use those as the brown. And again, you want a 3-to-1 ratio of brown food to your food scraps. Food scraps are considered green food. Brown food could be the straw, the paper, the leaves. Paper is higher in carbon, so you would need less paper ultimately. But still go with that 3-to-1 ratio. Same with the worm bin. I still always go with a 3-to-1 ratio of food scraps. When I'm adding food scraps, I add 3 times as much shredded, wet shredded or moist shredded paper, I should say, not wet shredded paper. But you can definitely use paper in your backyard bin as well. I use cardboard in our demo bins just to see like how fast it breaks down. Or if I don't feel like going digging in the leaf pile because I'm feeling lazy. And Abby says, hi, Anne. All right. Well, that looks like all the questions. And so if there aren't any other questions, I will bid you adieu to go try out your compost, our compost tea. And again, in 3 days, Tuesday at 10 a.m., you will get a follow-up email from me, and I will include the research links in there that I discovered, research papers. There'll be a little survey in there and my email. So you can always email me your pictures, your experiments, any questions that you have. Larry, you are very welcome for the ideas. You're welcome, Abby, as well as Kevin. All great. So thanks for joining me on this beautiful Saturday. Get out there and enjoy the sunshine. And I will see you at the next webinar that CSWD puts on, which I will put in the follow-up email as well. So thank you guys very much. Have a great morning.